After the marathon that was Chapter 1, we have reached Chapter 2. While Chapter 1 was long, the length of Chapter 2 was much shorter, for multiple reasons. The first being that all of the main characters of this saga have been introduced in one way or another. The second was a rewrite of the chapter after inserting Daniel into the plot. The third was realizing that lengthy chapters does not serve the story well. I actually cut out a portion of the end of this chapter, because I felt that it suited the next chapter better. By the end of this chapter, we will be halfway through the first saga. As I said in the Chapter 1 breakdown, the first two chapters set up the main plot of the saga. This chapter follows that format. Before we get into this, Chapter 2 is almost no influence from the original alternate universe template, as the repackaged plot will start to take over here. I do, though, use certain elements from the original template, as far as the characters go, but the next chapter is heavily inspired by the alternate universe template. The title of the chapter is A Sign from the Universes, inspired by the end of the chapter. More on that later. This chapter picks up immediately where Chapter 1 left off, Chris and Duran entering Jennifer's room in the hospital. When they walk in, not only is Tanya and Angela there, but Daniel is too. After the 5 trade barbs, Chris and Duran attempt to make their exit. Tanya stops them. Chris urges Duran to let him talk to Tanya alone. Chris and Tanya speak and they reveal an interesting wrinkle in the plot. Tanya goes back to Jennifer's room. Chris and Duran's actions motivate Tanya to retaliate. The next day, Duran reveals his interest in Brandy and asks her on a date. Chris and Duran continue to look for more information about the syndicate while at school. Black actually provides them with the name of a key member. Chris and Duran decide to encounter the syndicate at lunch that day. Anna becomes frustrated with Chris' focus of other matters. He promises Anna a date where they will be alone. Tanya gives Chris a letter. Not knowing what it says, he later reads it and soon finds out that a Wolfpack member was attacked. Daniel and Gabriel are the attackers, revealing Tanya's involvement. Next we meet the syndicate, who is led by a former friend of Chris and Duran. In order to deal with the syndicate, Chris and the Wolfpack agree to a truce with Tanya and company until spring break. At the Gundam tournament semi-final, the announcer receives a character name. Daniel's team advances to the final, but will be at a major disadvantage. Since teammates face permanent elimination, Chris elects that Hugh and Manny play the semi-final match. The two win and advance Chris' team to the finals. Before the finals, Duran attempts to get Anna to ask Chris on a date, not knowing that the two were already going on one. Since Daniel's teammates were eliminated, he is the sole survivor of his team. Instead of setting the battle's term to favor his team, Chris decides to face Daniel one-on-one. Chris wins, but his celebration is cut short. Not only does Tanya and company interrupt, but Dane shows up, putting both groups on notice. Chris and Anna push their dinner date to the next day after the tense moment. The chapter ends the same way the first chapter started, after Chris' monologue, with Uriah pushing the issue of the Andiron universe. This time she tells him that the next night, she will show him the Andiron universe. She recommends that he find a partner and to choose wisely. Uriah mentions Chris' father, who apparently went missing 10 years ago. First plot point, Chris and Tanya. Their exchange early in the chapter is much more revealing than the exchanges in Chapter 1. Tanya reveals that her and Chris do have a past that took place before the events of the Genesis saga. Chris briefly was a part of Tanya's group following his falling out with Brandy and Nick the previous school year, which was referenced in the start of Chapter 1. It seems that Tanya disagreed with him returning to that group. She does not clarify if the Wolfpack was involved or not, in its current form or a past one. From here on, the dynamic between these two starts to change. Ironically, Tanya makes no mention of the letter, and does not attempt to retrieve it, similar to the original template's version of Chris. I gave Chris and Tanya more of a past in order to further distance the finalized plot from the original template. Tanya is no longer a random girl that Chris likes, which was the original template's angle on the story. Second plot point, Anna and Chris. Anna is now a part of the Wolfpack, but is not involved in the day-to-day actions. Anna becomes frustrated by Chris constantly going off to do whatever it is he does. She makes this known to him after she storms out following Chris receiving the identity of a member of the syndicate. Chris goes after her and reveals that he cares about her. She wants to have lunch with Chris, but he already plans to go after the syndicate. He offers to take her on a date after the Gundam tournament finals that night. She accepts but wants Chris to promise that the two of them will be alone. Chris does and they both head to class. This plot point wraps up early in the chapter, but originally the date did take place in Chapter 2. I felt that it made the chapter too long, so I pushed that event to Chapter 3. I also noticed a continuity issue with the third plot point. I will dive into that during that part of the breakdown. Third plot point, Duran and Brandy. Reading back Chapter 1, I felt the need to increase Duran and Brandis' involvement in the plot. Since Duran shared no past with Tanya, he was somewhat a neutral figure in that situation. At the beginning of the chapter, his neutrality ends because he took exception to what Daniel had said in Chapter 1. After punching Daniel, he establishes himself as Daniel's rival. The next day Duran asks Brandy on a date. Brandy doesn't want to make it easy for him though. She accepts under the condition that he gets Chris and Anna to go on a double date with him. Duran later in the chapter tries convince Anna to go on a double date with him. Anna accepts but only under the condition of payment, which Duran forks over. So in the future a double date between the new group of friends is around the corner. The continuity issue occurred with this plot point when I realized that Duran's character asked Brandy on a date for Saturday, with Anna and Chris dates slated to take place following the Gundam tournament. Of course this made no sense, requiring Chris and Anna to go on a date 2 nights in a row, so I pushed their date to the next chapter, which takes place on Saturday, giving Duran an actual chance to get his date with Brandy. Fourth plot point, the Syndicate. Our mystery men mentioned in Chapter 1 are revealed here in Chapter 2. Taking place on that Friday at school, Ray and Fabian informs Chris of their main hangout. Chris and Duran's ally Black reveals a key member of the group, a former friend of theirs, Dane. From here Chris and Duran decide to investigate during lunch that day and recruits Manny to help. When in position, Chris, Duran, and Manny witness their rivals Tanya and Daniel talk casually with members of the Syndicate. Before Chris and his group can move and someone approaches Chris and walks him into one of the classrooms. Dane is there waiting for him, and being a former friend of his, he knows a lot. He offers to keep Tanya and company out of the way if he does not interfere with them. Chris of course declines, telling him that he can handle his own problems. Dane makes an appearance again later in the chapter, which I will cover during the next plot point. Fifth plot point, the Gundam Tournament Finals. I covered my reasons for the Gundam video game tournament during the Chapter 1 breakdown. In this chapter, I use it to establish multiple things. The first is Chris' past with Dane not just being mentioned, but briefly explained. Based off of Chris' words, his past with Dane takes place before the Genesis Saga. Following Chris defeating Daniel in the finals, Tanya shows up. She actually compliments Chris, with Daniel doing the opposite. Duran once again steps up to Daniel, adding more heat to their rivalry. Dane shows up and puts both Tanya and company along with Chris and the Wolfpack on notice. Both groups don't back down, and Dane leaves after some final words from Chris and Tanya. Because of the unexpected appearance of Dane, Chris and Anna agree to go on their date the next night, which is Saturday. I also created a new character, Crystal, the Gundam tournament announcer. Even though the tournament is over, you will see her again, sort of. Sixth plot point, the Andiron universe. After the Gundam tournament, Chris is at home. He lays down to sleep. Once again the character Uriah appears to him in what he believes is a dream. She tells him that he is an astral projection. This time Uriah tells him that he has been chosen to defend the Andiron universe. She briefly describes what it is, and suggests that he find a partner to travel there with him. She lets him know that he has until tomorrow night. Uriah also warns to choose a partner wisely because whoever he chooses will also be bound to defend the Andiron universe. Once again, the Andiron universe is an alternate world. We can break down some of the nuts and bolts in the next breakdown. That ends the breakdown of Chapter 2. Chapter 3 is next, and we are all about to travel down alternate way.